Well, I think we'll kick this off. Good day or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. We'd like to extend a warm virtual welcome from the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. I'm Angela Hawken, the director of the Marron Institute. For those of you who are not familiar with the Marron Institute, we're different from a traditional academic department. We're a provostial institute that operates as a think-do tank, and our mandate is impact. We invest in academics and practice scholars who are interested in on-the-ground research. We work alongside practitioners and the public they serve to test new ideas and approaches that are scalable and have the potential to dramatically improve the quality of life for people in cities across the globe. Thank you all for being with us today. We're delighted that you've taken the time to attend this webinar, which is our inaugural session, the first in the Anatomy of Density webinar series. We'll be hosting webinars in this series every 4 weeks over the next few months, and we hope that you'll have opportunities to attend others also. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our host for today, Dr. Eduardo Moreno. Dr. Moreno is the Director of Research and Innovation at UN Habitat, the United Nations Human Settlements Program, headquartered in Nairobi. He's also the interim representative of the agency in Mexico and Cuba. Dr. Moreno has over 35 years of academic and professional experience in housing and urban development policies, institutional analysis, global monitoring, and equity and urban poverty issues. He has a PhD in urban geography from the University of Paris-Sorbonne, a master's degree in urban sociology, also from Sorbonne, and a BA in architecture from the University of Guadalajara, Mexico. Dr. Moreno has an extensive number of publications, including 6 books on topics related to social housing, land policies, urban history, equity, and urban development. Dr. Moreno, we are deeply honored that you've taken the time to join us today. Thank you for being with us. I'll now hand over to you to introduce our panel. Welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Angela. Good afternoon to all of you from Nairobi, Kenya, the headquarters of UN Habitat, where I am now. Let me start by saying the most important thing. I'm delighted, I'm very honored to be invited to participate with New York University and Marron Institute in this fundamental topic of the anatomy of density. To tell you that I had been following for many years the work of Alan and Soli, and lately I met Anjali. So for me are 3 scholars that are very respected and from whom I learn a lot. So it's really my pleasure to be with you and to tell you that anatomy and density are two words that are strongly connected to the fundamental notion of the science of cities. And I know that Soli has been an important agent propagating this notion of the science of cities. And when we understand here, we talk about in the notion of anatomy of dissection, of separation, and densities on the fundamental notion of units of measurement and all the factors that are associated with this. I have been following this study and this presentation that Soli is going to do, and to tell you that it is one of these wonderful cases in which we can see how serious empirical analysis connects to policy implications and densification and policy strategies. And I'm very, very glad to see that because it worked very well, as we see. I'm going to present to you the panel and then to move to the next element that will be the introduction of the Global Urban Lecture Series. In fact, the agenda was the other way around, but I think it's important to know a little bit more of the people that we are going to be working today. Let me start, as we should, with Anjali Mahendra. She is the director of the global research at the World Resource Institute in the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. Her expertise is wide, but I would like to mention only on urban transportation, land use strategies, health, economic, environmental, and equity impacts. She's passionate, as I think many of us, to connect research with practice on sustainability issues. And she has worked in, I would say, almost all over the world, particularly US, Europe, Latin America, and India. She's currently leading a flagship research of the same institute towards a more equal city that investigates how rapidly growing cities in the global south can achieve equitable access to core urban services. a theme that is strongly connected to the notion of density, as we are going to see. She has authored many papers, and she has given a lot of priority strategies to manage urban expansion and to improve access to opportunities to all in urban residents. Anjali has a master's degree in city planning, in transportation, a master, and a PhD in urban and regional planning. All of this in MIT. He's trained as an architect from the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, India. As you can see, we have a wonderful researcher and someone who has devoted a lot of time, energy, and knowledge to the notion of the connection to the theme on densities. Alain Berthaud, now a fellow from the Marron Institute, is author of many, many books, but the last one, The Order Without Design and How Markets Shape Cities, from MIT Press. He has previously worked in a position of urban planner at the World Bank. I think this is the place where I met him. It's not in the small CV that he gave us, or someone gave us, but to tell you that in the beginning of my career, also with SOLI, I studied a lot the Urban Indicators program that with UN Habitat, Bertrand and SOLI developed, and it was widely used in many countries in the world. He retired from the World Bank in 1999, and since then he has worked as an independent consultant. Prior to joining the World Bank, he worked also in numerous cities and countries in the world: Bangkok, Salvador, Port-au-Prince, Sanaa in Yemen, New York, Paris, Tlemcen in Algeria, and Chandigarh in India. Her research, in collaboration with the GIS expert, Marie-Agnès Berthaud, I suspect a connection of the family, aims to bridge the gap between operational urban planning and urban economics. And this is very important, again, in this fundamental notion of density, residential, and also economic densities associated to cities. And perhaps we would like to hear from that. He has a lot of experience in the interaction between urban form, real estate markets, and regulations. He's a DPLG diplomat from the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And let me go now to Soli Angel, a very good friend of mine, and also of UN Habitat. He's a professor of city planning in the same Marron Institute, and he leads the New York urban expansion-based research at the Stern Urbanization Project. He's an expert on urban development policy. He has advised many, many important organizations, United Nations, including a lot of work with us in Nairobi and elsewhere, with the World Bank, the Interagency Development Bank. And he currently works on documenting the urban expansion in the developing world. A work that in UN Habitat, we were very happy because in preparation for Habitat 3, he was so generous to work with us in a very advanced research with the Lincoln Institute and UN Habitat, and we launched a report associated to urban expansion. He started a program in human settlement planning and development at the Asian Institute of Technology in Bangkok. Very wide experience as well. From 1973 to 83, he was researching in housing and urban development in the East, South, and Southeast Asia. In the 80s and 90s, he worked as the Housing and Urban Development Consultant to UN Habitat, the Asian Development Bank, and the government of Thailand. In 2000, he published Housing Policy Matters, which was a very interesting comparative study on housing conditions and policies. And later on, he continued working in this topic in different cities in Latin America. All of us, we know him for his studies on the urban expansion of cities. And I want to welcome this wonderful list of great scholars and minds of sustainable urban development. And I would like to start this by presenting to you, and I'm sure Juan Fernando will be ready, a presentation that he developed for UN Habitat, a very interesting one, on something that we call the Global Urban Lecture Series. To tell you that this series are the bestseller of UN Habitat. We are in the 5th series, and they are the most regarded videos in the history of our agency. and Soli Angel participated with this anatomy of densities. These videos are training and capacity building materials for academic, professional, and other important purposes. We invite normally in UN Habitat very well reputed, very well known experts that work with us or are close to us to present in no more than 15 minutes a synopsis of the topic they present, a biography of the speaker, and links to the study in which we want to hear the content and the proposal in terms of policy on what he presented, which is now the case with anatomy of density. He's going to present to us the factors that he has been using to measure density and a very strong connection to policy mechanisms, policy making in increasing densities in cities. I don't want to say anything else. I think it was a long presentation, but it deserves with this caliber of speakers that we have. So Juan Fernando, if we can perhaps run the video and we will continue later on.
My name is Shlomo, or Soli Angel, and I am a professor of city planning at the Marron Institute of Urban Management at New York University. My lecture today is about urban density, and more specifically, the average population density of a city as a whole, ignoring the variations in density within it. One of the aims of my lecture is to increase density literacy. There are many different ways to define and measure urban density, and this can be quite confusing. I hope to remove some of this confusion. Urban density is a key policy metric because it is a measure of how large a footprint of a city with a given population will occupy, and it is a good proxy for how long its infrastructure lines will be or how far people will have to travel to get from place to place. One of the attractive things about urban density is that it is measurable. And as Lord Kelvin said, if we measure it, we know something about it. And if we can measure it, we can do something about it. Let us define urban density at the outset. Urban density is simply the ratio of the total population of the city and the total footprint the city occupies. We measure urban density in, say, persons per hectare, where a hectare is 1% of a square kilometer. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, had an average of 372 persons per hectare in 2014. Minneapolis in the United States had an average of 10. Urban density in Dhaka was 37 times that of Minneapolis. But just knowing these facts does not tell us much. They hide more than they reveal. In what sense is Dhaka's density high? In what sense is Minneapolis's density low? The key insight we present here is in exposing the anatomy of density and showing that urban density can be factored into separate metrics that expose its internal structure. What do we mean by factoring? We can factor the number 12, for example, into two factors, 3 and 4, that when multiplied together yield 12. 3 and 4 are factors of 12. So are 6 and 2. In a similar manner, we can factor urban density into 2, 3, 4, and even 7 metrics. In doing so, we build a structure that incorporates and integrates most of the familiar density metrics used by urban planners. What we discovered and are able to report here is that the factors that constitute urban density are measurable as well. In fact, we measured them in a rigorous manner in 10 representative cities from different world regions, and we plan to measure them in a global sample of 200 cities. The results surprised us. The density of each of these 10 cities depended on quite different factors. We will get into that soon. Let me start by showing what it means to break urban density into factors. Factors then, when multiplied together, reconstitute urban density. Floor space occupancy on the left is the ratio of the population of a city and its total residential floor area. It is a measure of how many people occupy a unit of residential floor area. The more there are, the less floor area per person. It is a gross measure of how crowded dwelling units in the city are. Floor area density on the right is the ratio of the total residential floor area of the city and the total area of the city's urban footprint. It is a measure of the density of residential floor area in the city, or more generally, of how common it is to find residential floor area or residential floor space in the city. The more of it there is, the more people the city accommodates. You can see that when we multiply one by the other, floor area cancels out, and we get people divided by the urban footprint, which is our definition of urban density. So, by factoring urban density into two factors, we gain some insight about its anatomy. The more people per unit floor area, the higher the urban density. The more floor area per areal unit of the city's urban footprint, the higher the urban density. We can go further. We can also break down floor area density into two factors, thus decomposing urban density into three factors. The floor area ratio, the yellow box, is a common density metric. It's defined here as the ratio of the total residential floor area in the city and the total residential area of the city, net of streets and other land uses. The residential share, the blue box on the right, is the share of the city's urban footprint occupied by residential areas. Again, when we multiply the floor area ratio by residential share, the residential area in the city cancels out and we get floor area density. This means that we can represent urban density as a product of three factors: floor space occupancy, floor area ratio, and residential share. When we represent urban density as a product of three factors, we can think about it as a box in three-dimensional space, where floor space occupancy is its width, its x-axis, residential share is its length, its y-axis, and floor area ratio is its height, its z-axis. We obtained values for these three factors for 10 cities in different world regions: Dhaka, Hong Kong, Kinshasa, Bogota, Cairo, Baku, Madrid, Bangkok, Wuhan, and Minneapolis. The urban density boxes for these cities are shown here in gray in order of declining density from left to right. The colored cube on the top left represents the density average value for each factor. We can now see that different cities get their urban densities from quite different factors. Dhaka, the city with the highest density in the group, gets its density from above average floor space occupancy and residential share, while its floor area ratio is below average. Hong Kong, the second highest urban density, gets its high density from its above average floor area ratio, even though it has low residential share. Kinshasa, the third highest urban density, gets its high density from its very high floor space occupancy. It is extremely overcrowded. An above average residential share, but its floor area ratio is way below average. In fact, every city has a unique combination of factors that give it its urban density, and we cannot guess the value of these factors from information about urban density alone. We need to look at them and measure them one by one. And the anatomy of density can go even further. We can factor urban density into four factors. We do so by factoring floor area ratio into two factors: building height and plot coverage. Building height is the ratio of the residential floor area and the area of all the residential building footprints in the city. It is a measure of the average number of residential floors on a given residential building footprint. Plot coverage is the share of the residential area in the city that is covered by residential building footprints. Again, when we multiply them together, residential building footprints cancels out and we get floor area divided by residential area, which is the floor area ratio. We now know that urban density is a product of four factors: floor space occupancy, building height, plot coverage, and residential share. It increases when either one increases, other things being equal, and declines when either one declines. Finally, we can go even further. We can also decompose floor space occupancy into 4 factors as well. The first is dwelling unit occupancy, which measures the number of persons in an occupied dwelling unit. The second is the occupancy rate, which measures the share of the total number of dwelling units in the city that are occupied, i.e. not vacant. The third is dwelling unit packing, which measures the number of dwelling units in a hectare of residential living area. It is the reciprocal of the average size of a dwelling unit in the city. The fourth is floor plan efficiency, which measures the share of the floor area of residential buildings in the city that is devoted to living areas, net of common spaces. Again, when we multiply all 4 together, everything cancels out and we get floor space occupancy. This essentially means that we can represent urban density as a product of 7 measurable factors: dwelling unit occupancy, the occupancy rate, dwelling unit packing, floor plan efficiency, building height, plot coverage, and residential share. We can now see that in order to densify a city, we must increase one or more of these factors while ensuring that others do not decline. This kind of analysis has useful policy implications. We can increase dwelling unit occupancy, for example, by increasing the number of people that occupy a single dwelling unit. In times of crisis, we can do so by forcing family to share dwelling units. Otherwise, we can encourage communal living and larger households, or we can encourage lowering dwelling unit size. We can increase the occupancy rate by removing barriers and incentives that keep a larger than necessary share of the housing stock vacant. We can do so by introducing a vacancy tax on empty units, by permitting the leasing of vacant homes, by overcoming the resistance of owners to rent vacant units, by discouraging the supply of units not in demand, and by reversing central city abandonment. We can increase dwelling unit packing by encouraging people to reduce their consumption of floor area per person and to refrain from increasing it as they become better off. We can do this by allowing the subdivision of dwelling units, by removing minimum size limits on apartments, by eliminating the lending bias against condos, by avoiding displacement through urban renewal, and by encouraging the residential mobility of older people. We can increase floor plan efficiency by removing barriers and incentives that lower the share of living areas in the total residential area under construction. We can do this by encouraging lightweight construction, by improving high-rise building design, and by reducing parking requirements. We can increase building height by revising regulatory barriers and incentives that prevent the increase of residential floor space with taller multi-story buildings. We can do that by relaxing building height restrictions, by allowing the addition of floors on existing roofs, by increasing access to construction finance, by increasing allowable floor area ratios, and by expanding zoning for multifamily dwellings. We can increase plot coverage by removing or redesigning regulations that limit the share of the area of residential plots that building footprints can occupy. We can do that by reducing minimum lot size for single-family homes, by relaxing setback regulations, by allowing multiple units on single-family plots, and by increasing allowable floor area ratios. Finally, we can increase residential share by increasing the share of residential and mixed-use areas in the city, thus limiting the loss of residential area to other land uses. We can do so by accelerating the conversion of commercial and industrial areas to residential land use, by encouraging mixed use, by avoiding mass evictions for urban highways, and by avoiding the overallocation of lands for industrial use. To conclude, we can decompose urban density into measurable factors that allow us to explore its anatomy. They allow us to understand how different cities acquire their density and to see that they acquire it in different ways, something we could not see by simply looking at variations in urban density. Decomposing urban density into its factors also allows us to design comprehensive urban densification strategies, strategies that look at all the possible ways to increase urban density in a systematic way. The anatomy of density thus provides urban planners and policymakers with a tool that allows them both to implement complex densification plans and to measure how increases in each of the factors contribute to progress in densification, now a key goal in our global urban agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this video, this presentation, Soli. I take three things, and I'm not going to explain your video because you are going to do it. The first one is this great idea of taking three different cities in which you will have more or less the same density, but Hong Kong or the other going horizontal, the other one keeping vertical, etc. This is a very good way of showing how density relates to many other factors, as you presented. For me, this is a great presentation for several reasons. One, in 14 minutes, you managed to dissect such a difficult topic and to present something that, in my view, is extremely important: the connection to policies, the connection to policy making strategies for densification. And third one that I think all of us appreciate is the learning, the literacy that it comes with this fundamental notion of density. I would like to ask you, Soli, you did this, I think, 3 years ago or so. Do you have some afterthoughts? Do you think if you were to do again this video, something that you will consider that requires to be included, or something that needs to be simplified, or another specific thing that you will consider important for us to learn in addition to the presentation? Sorry.
Thank you, Eduardo. I don't think that the structure needs to change, even though I'm more flexible in allowing different ways of agglomerating this. The structure itself is it's proving to be quite resilient. And a group in Germany has copied it pretty much word for word and did a study of Japanese cities. So this is easy to use and quite useful. What I do need to do is get more examples. I don't think that 10 cities give us enough empirical material to learn more about that structure. And we think that if we did a couple of 100 cities, that would teach us new things about how to do this properly.
Second question, and I'm going to move to our other colleagues. In what you presented, these 7 factors that all of them explain in different forms density, and tell us something very important. It's not a matter of responding to densities just to look into the population and the footprint. We need to look to many other variables, as you presented. My question to you is, working and living in Africa and looking to some cities that have relatively high densities, but very poor connectivity, to which extent you could consider in one moment adding an 8th factor that will be connectivity as a way of explaining density. For instance, some cities with very low density, Atlanta, Minnesota, as you mentioned in your presentation, comparing with Dhaka, 37 times less, but good connectivity to some extent makes the land efficient or the land efficient in terms of use, but which is not the case in many other cities in the world that have poor connectivity. To which extent you will include not only at the policy level, but at the factor level analysis, connectivity in this type of analysis? Over to you.
Eduardo, the short answer to that is the PhD thesis that I did 50 years ago that was so mathematical that I don't understand it anymore. But the idea is that good connectivity shrinks space. So in a way, the denominator, which now is space, with good connectivity is actually smaller. So let's say if we have a city of 100 square kilometers that can be traversed in 10 minutes, and another city that can be traversed in 20 minutes, the actual size of the city shrinks by that square root of 2 in that case. So I think there's another notion of density which takes space-time as its denominator rather than just space. But that is a very good idea, and it requires further study.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to other questions, but I would like to say something on behalf of UN Habitat about density. The first thing is that, as you know, we are custodian of Goal 11, which means that we are working with other agencies and partners in the monitoring and reporting of this, the goal of cities. And Goal 11 has 14 targets, and 8 out of these 14 targets require new measurements of the city in which density play an important role. And still, in many of these targets, we don't have solely, as you know, the correct response to many of these things. I have the honor to be representing UN Habitat in New York, where I've met you several times, and you were intellectually so generous to help me to develop the land efficient use model of this in order to try to understand urban sprawl and to measure how efficient cities could be connected to this. And I would like to use this introduction to ask Anjali one question. When we were applying the City Prosperity Initiative that we use today in more than 600 cities in the world, and there is one indicator on density, we found that particularly in the urban expansion of cities, where densities tend to reduce, there was a kind of threshold in which below 90 or 80 inhabitants per hectare, with low critical mass of people, it was difficult to produce or to provide public goods. Particularly in your case, I would like to know basic services that you are working on. I would like to know if you believe there is something like optimal, ideal density, and if that is the case, which will be this threshold, understanding all the variables that Soli Angel mentioned that of course we need to take into account, but still in these responses, I would like to know what is your view on this notion of optimal expenditures associated to density. Anjali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, also for the kind introduction in the beginning, and thank you to the Marron Institute for inviting me. Really honored to be on this panel. So I would say, in light of what we've just seen, this video and this work on the anatomy of density that I have been fascinated by for a couple of years, I heard about it. I think in particular, you know, the one big lesson is that you cannot think of population density, citywide population density, as this homogeneous indicator that you can then start to think of attaching an optimal value to. My sense is, and you know, this is based on deep work we do in cities, and particularly in the Global South at the Ross Center, the cultural norms, the notions around living space and density differ so much, region to region, country to country, that coming up with a global sort of optimal number around that could not be meaningful, might not be meaningful. The other thing is, you know, just some of the examples Soli was just showing, I find it remarkable. I could catch, for example, Kinshasa and Bogota, two cities with roughly the same population density, have very different conditions driving that density. Kinshasa is largely driven by overcrowding, Bogota by building heights, buildings being taller, maybe I think higher residential share. So right there, it shows you that once you start unpacking this idea of density, very different conditions are driving that density. And you really need to be aware of that local context. The policies that you will use to densify in each of these contexts will be very different based on that. One last point on this optimal density idea. I am a firm believer that, density is a neutral indicator. We tend to attach sort of value-related notions to it. There's been debates now during COVID about, good density and bad density and how density is causing all of this disease transmission. Others say, no, it's not the density, it's the absence of services. So I do think we should retain the notion of density as a neutral indicator and use it as a tool or a mechanism to address the broader goals under goal 11, the sustainability related goals, the affordability related goals, equitable access to services, land utilization. Use density as the tool or mechanism to arrive at, to go in a better direction related to those targets you want to achieve, but not so much be caught up in trying to come up with an optimal density number. That's I think just the position. I could be convinced based on more research and maybe if I see your data on the 600 cities. I also want to say I think this density idea and the unpacking of it is so important because it really starts to show you how whatever you do with density and compact cities is never going to yield the benefits that you think it will unless it is supported by the infrastructure and services. We work, like I said, in cities of the global south. The biggest question that comes up when you go into a Mumbai or you go into an African city, you go into Kinshasa, is how can we in such a very dense city, already dense city with overburdened infrastructure, further densify? What would be the best approach to do? And I think this unpacking of the concept into indicators of floor space occupancy, overcrowding, really starts to give you a very good idea, because what is overcrowding? Overcrowding is the inadequacy of living space, of good quality living space and services. So it really starts to help you unpack what you need to be addressing in terms of meeting that sort of need for basic services and more equitable services. I hope that answers your question. Did I miss some part of it, Eduardo?
I think, but I will come back to Alan with another question, but I would like to come back to something. I fully agree with you that the indicators are neutral. Not only density, all indicators, but still we need to attach to indicators, at least for human habitat, in a global perspective of monitoring, some value whether you are moving out of some optimal thresholds for the city to operate better. That applies to an indicator in the sense that what we will recommend is some form of higher density in the sense of walkability, compact cities, in the sense of providing services to these cities. Let me come back to the same question from another perspective. And I heard what you say about Kinshasa, but not taking into account Kinshasa, but 200 cities in the world. What do you think the equitable access to urban services will be improved with higher densities, or densities will not play that much and it will be the governance or the provision of basic services? I would like to hear from you on that. Same question, for instance, we recommend cities to plan better economies of scale or economies of agglomeration with optimal densities that converge infrastructure density with residential densities in order to make the city more optimal and to have, I would say, better returns in terms of infrastructure. Do you think there is a connection on that, and which will be this, and how you can connect to policy recommendations?
Sure, I'll try to answer in brief. I definitely think there is a connection between density and provision of infrastructure and access to services that people have. And that's why I said, the two need to go together. You cannot just have densification policies that are not supported by augmenting the infrastructure. And in fact, one of the reasons we may be seeing Bogota having more taller buildings and being able to still have good level of livability is because the city actually has a very sophisticated land value capture policy, where basically they build higher, which takes more investment, takes more costs, it's more expensive to build higher, but they are able to, through capturing the value of the land, use that money to invest in taller buildings. Many other cities in South Asia and Africa do not have that kind of mature mechanisms in place, policies in place, institutional structures, land markets to allow that to happen. So what you end up seeing is high population densities that are unserviced, poorly serviced, and that is a problem. So I do think that that there is much else to be done outside of just density to improve that situation. One other point I'd like to make is, we did a study. We looked at 300 studies on the impacts of increasing urban density, and came away with the conclusion that while there are lots of benefits in terms of emissions reduction, land use efficiency, land value increases, and so on, economic benefits, one of the biggest drawbacks has been in all of these 300 cities, affordability is a huge challenge when you, it's empirical data. So it shows you that these densification programs have resulted in the poor being left out and needing to be displaced because gentrification and so on. And so there is something to be said about doing density or implementing densification programs in a way that you enhance the infrastructure and services, but keep things affordable, keep it affordable. And some of that, again, ties into policies like inclusionary zoning. How do you make sure you can increase density in parts of the city that are very well connected already? Going back to Soli's point about connectivity and your point, how do you increase density in well-connected, well-serviced parts of the city? And that's going to take many other sort of policy changes related to the land markets and land value capture and all of this that I'm talking. It's also going to take increasing and augmenting the base infrastructure to support that density. Otherwise, you would be leading to, again, sort of unaffordable, overcrowded conditions, and the cycle repeats itself. Stop there.
Thank you very much, Anjali, for that. Let me move to Alan. Alan, I would like to ask you two questions. The first one, knowing that you have been working a lot on real estate markets, do you see in many of the cities that you have been working a strong correlation between density, urban form, and favorable or less favorable real estate markets in the sense of benefits, prosperity, and economics? Because in some countries, real estate markets can prosper in low development kind of suburbia, but in others is more associated to densities. Do you see a connection there? What is your analysis on that?
I think that in this discussion, I basically agree very much with what Anjali has said about difficult to establish a minimum or a maximum of densities, or an optimum one. I think it's really depends on the level of development of the city, and that's connected to your question. Cities planners have a tendency to think that they can shape a city the way a sculptor, sculpts make a sculpture. This is not quite true. What decide of density is really it's really the price of land. There is no reason to build high unless the price of land is very high. And, in a way, the densities, not densities, that the important thing is the floor space. A city is made of floor space. And this floor space is being built at a high density, what the floor ratio that Soli was talking about, precisely when people substitute capital for land. Land is expensive, they substitute capital. That means that every household to live in a high-rise building have to have access to a minimum of capital. And I think that's what Anjali was talking about when she was talking about affordability. So if you have households which have at their disposal, with subsidy or without subsidy, a capital which is less than, let's say, $6,000 or $10,000, they are condemned to live horizontally. That means that their consumption of land will be more than their consumption of floor space. If they are richer, if they're, again, it depends on the let's say the level of income of a city, then they can substitute capital for land if they want to. The other element is the speed of transport. and the availability of transport. For instance, in a city like Hanoi, where a lot of people are using motorcycle, they can access a lot of land which is normally not accessible and at a relatively high speed. So all these elements conjure together. What I mean is that there is no, the planner doesn't have a choice as saying, let us do a high density here or a low density there. It is all coming from elements like the price of land, the income of different groups, and the speed of transport. So I think what is very important in Solly's approach is that he has indeed decomposed what constitute densities. And all these elements have to be played together depending on the income of the people and their culture, by the way. People do put different priorities to different things. In a high-income family in Paris who live in 60 square meters because they like the amenities, because they make this trade-off. In Texas, this type of trade-off will not be acceptable. So again, there is a cultural aspect which is reflected by market.
Thank you very much, Alan. Solly, you wanted to say something on this?
Yes, I want to continue Alan's suggestion of trade-offs, because I think this is key to answering your earlier question to Anjali about a threshold. So I don't think a threshold exists for urban density as a whole, but when you start to talk about factors, you get an idea of what the trade-offs are. So for example, if you're talking about overcrowding, and some people in, let's say, the Kachiabadis in Dhaka living with 2 square meters per person, we can say this is not enough. That we can say that a meaningful standard is at least 6 meters per person. So we can begin to say something about this is inhuman to ask people to live at 2 meters per person. In the same way, if you're looking at the urban villages in China, and you're looking at these handshake buildings that are as far apart as 2 people from 2 windows being able to shake hands, you're saying, okay, this is fine. It has a very high density, but it comes at the cost of light and air. So you're trading light and air, especially in the lower floors, by allowing plot coverage, which is very, very, very high, like in the 90-95%. So that means it kind of puts some boundary of what plot coverage, of what setback is. So there's a trade-off between density, is higher plot coverage, and light and air, which is what got Corbusier and people like that to talk about towers in the park, substituting light and air and health for density. In the same way, finally, well, Alain was talking, yes, where incomes are higher and you have construction finance, you can build high. But when you build high, there's a cost to that too. I mean, I've seen, for example, some high-rise public housing in Panama City where the elevators have been vandalized. They don't have the capacity to maintain elevators. Well, that's fine that you built those things that are 14, 15 stories high, but without elevators. So all I'm trying to say is that density has trade-offs. And by looking at these trade-offs, or if one final one, the occupancy rate, the higher the occupancy, the greater the density. But when the occupancy rate is too high, the vacancy rate is too low, and you don't have a well-functioning real estate market. There's not enough product in the market. So that means you don't want occupancy rates to be too high. So what I think, to continue what Alain was saying, to get at these thresholds, you have to understand the trade-offs of the different factors of density. And just to have one big number doesn't allow us to see these trade-offs one by one.
Thank you. I fully agree with this threshold. Let me ask another question to Alan. Now, we don't talk about the city, but just to say that I fully agree with Anjali's comment on densities being the culprit at the beginning of the pandemic in the minds of many people for transmission. And today, I think it's widely documented all over the world that densities per se, they don't play an important role, but other defining factors, overcrowding and perhaps the capacity of the health service and many inequalities, etc. Just to comment on this. But Alan, one question, and I talk about now cities and regions, kind of another scale. In many of the literature associated to densities, economic growth, I have seen that population density as an economic activity was neglected in many of the economic theory analysis. In other words, densities were not considered in economic analysis. For instance, two countries or two cities, as Soli was presented, with the same densities, they were treated in terms of macroeconomic growth and development similarly or differently, but density was not playing an important aspect on this. My question to you is, do you think there is an influence on which one of population density on infrastructure development and the economic potential of city growth at large?
Well, I think in the literature, you find that even macroeconomists recognize concentration of activity and wealth as a factor of productivity. I think that's well recognized. I think that I don't think that you could find a, let's say, a GDP per city, which is linked to density. You have high density cities, which are extremely efficient, like Hong Kong, for instance. And you have, let us recognize that a city like Houston or Dallas are cities which are also very efficient in terms of producing jobs. You know, if you are now in the United States and you are a young person looking for a job, probably you are better off going a job and housing at the same time. You are probably better off going to Atlanta and Houston than going to New York or San Francisco. So we have to solve this. And I'm not saying, by the way, that New York and San Francisco are doomed, but I think that they have created a regulatory straitjacket which do not permit any flexibility and any adjustment. And they are dying from that. I think that the beauty of the work that Sally has done is to decompose all those elements together to see the trade-off, and where in fact we have a lot of regulatory constraint which do not allow you precisely, or the market or the decision of people and not allow them to make a trade-off which will correspond to what they want. You know, for instance, there are less and less, the household size in large cities are much smaller than they were 20 years ago. And the housing stock doesn't reflect that. And it will be reflected in, with the parameter than Sally developed. So if we look at we can identify what are these regulatory straitjacket, regulatory problem that we have, and remove them. Don't forget that the idea is to remove the constraint, is not to add more in general.
Thank you very much. Let me move to the questions that had been addressed to us. I'm going to read some of them, and I would ask you three to take some notes, and we will devote one round of responses to those that you consider apply more to your center of interest, to your knowledge, or basically that you would like to comment. Robin Rajak, a good friend from IBD, is asking if Dharavi has an efficient use of urban land. Does it compete with more conventional prescriptions of highest and best use that typically focus on FAR? Does it maximum customer interface at ground level, or introduce another material dimension of urban density that is economically focused? I think, Anjali, that will be a good question for you. You got what he's asking for, more or less? You could read the question and answers and make a I have from William Alfonso, who is a professor, and he's asking if in Bogota, a high density in popular neighborhoods without sufficient infrastructure is an informal way. Many more people are accommodated per building with a simple process of subdivision. Has this massive overcrowding factor been considered? Perhaps, Soli, you could comment on that. Sergio Frey, he commented that indicators are to be sustainable. In other words, they require repeated data to be measured and monitored, especially challenging when globally adopted. Which are some of the challenges with this density in this respect? I would like perhaps, Alan, if you can comment on this, because in your experience on urban indicators, perhaps you could do some transversal or longitudinal analysis of urban densities and your view on this. And there is another one that is anonymous, which is quite connected to what Anjali mentioned, but also the other two later on. It's how we can work towards increasing density to address current demand while anticipating growth, population, and affordability issues. In other words, and I think, Soli, in your study of city expansion, you address this. What will be your view in catching up with the future in terms of density and space? Juanca is saying that he said that in the different factors and policies that you presented, he asked a question, how you can include land value or land in urban infrastructure in order to increase densities, as a question, which I think is a quite good one. And by the way, all the recommendations that you gave to the different factors in your video are just great, Soli. Ty Eister, okay, this is a question that is very recurrent in many of the analyses, the definition of the city in spatial terms, and then densities applied to built-up areas and the contiguous of built-up areas. But the reality is that in many cases, when we talk about the anatomy of density, densities are measured and units at the municipal level. So the mismatching or the lack of convergence between one and the others, what will be your thoughts on that? I think it's a very interesting question. Anthony Ling from Brazil, or he's saying in Brazil, there is a trend to stimulate development in transit corridors, aligning with the idea of Anjali of coordinating density with infrastructure. Then he's asking how this has been implemented by restricting development and densities in other areas of the city. In other words, I think what is the correlation of this, or the relationship to permitting in some places, restricting in others growth and development. Igor Ribeiro da Costa, I can see we have a large Portuguese connection here. I'm very glad for this. There is an optimal morphology for a city, is asking, or a grid or a topography adapted urban layout to achieve a good city performance. If there is a connection between the layout, the urban form, and city performance. And I think there have been many studies on this. Many years ago, I did one on the colonial pattern and the effectiveness of la quadricula, these blocks of these patterns in development, and your view on something like this. Aneska Sevek from Kingston in New York, she's saying that density in countries like India is not necessarily linked to the spread of COVID-19 because of possible inherent immunity of the population to high viral loads, which is not the case in the US. And he thinks that because of that, the positive and negative effects of density are varied. In other words, if there is a kind, here will be more the health and the cultural and the immunity conditions that in the case of Africa is a theory that has been used in many of these cities and countries, that there is this kind of historic or automatic protection. Okay, Leonardo believes that perhaps coming back to the idea of an optimal density, if we can measure in a kind of oscillatory in-between range. In other words, optimal density is not a number, but it's a space in which we can say in some cities or countries, when you are inside this in terms of quantitative and qualitative data, you are in something that could be considered positive. These are, I think, I have one or two more, but Juan Carlos, I stop here because of this. And I would ask now in the reverse order, let me start with Alan. If you want to pick any of these and make some comments, and tell me in what it was you hear, if you would like to comment on response of one of these things. Alan, please.
There was a question on densities and sustainabilities. I think it was linked with the level of infrastructure. If we have areas, for instance, in some part of Bogota, where you have high densities, but the infrastructure is not sufficient to support this density. My answer to that is, what are the tools of the planner and the municipality? The tool that they have is not to decrease densities, but to put people somewhere else. The tool that they have is to invest in infrastructure. I don't think that there is such a high density that infrastructure cannot be provided. So I think that the answer here is the job of the planners is to understand densities, again, using all those indicators, and then provide the infrastructure of the density as they are. Now, if there are, let's say, too high densities in some areas, some high density or high occupancy, that the important thing is there's no such thing as too high density. There are such thing as too high floor occupancy, so if that's the case, increasing the supply of land and floor space is the most important. What I draw from the whole thing, frankly, is that we can now develop, with those indicators, we can develop what is the consumption of floor space and land, and how much land and floor space can be built within the constraint of regulation or infrastructure. And that's, I think, to me, is important. And also that within every city, we have to have a large range of densities. There is no such thing as an optimum density for an entire city. It might be desirable in a certain area to have high density, but desirable in another to have low densities. And this change of density within cities is observable absolutely everywhere. Even in cities like Atlanta, which has extremely low densities, there are still variation of 1 to 5 between a suburb of Atlanta and the center of Atlanta. So you see this variation of density, and this is driven by the people themselves and the safe system of transport. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent response and keeping the time very well. Let me now move to Anjali.
Thank you. I'll pick a couple of the questions. One about Dharavi, which is considered Asia's biggest slum, is located in Mumbai, has extremely high population densities. The question is about how does that compare with policies that focus on FAR, and can it be considered a really high and good use of best use of land? I just want to make one point clear that we should not be conflating floor area ratio policies, built form densities with population densities. It is actually one of the banes of the profession, I think, in places like India, again, where FAR floor area ratios are low. The response of planners is to increase density by raising the FAR ratios. What you end up seeing happens, and this relates to the political economy of the land markets, private developers, they build tall buildings with extremely high living space, and it undermines all of the equity and affordability issues because you see largely affluent people being able to purchase those. You see lower income people being displaced out. So what ends up happening is that the population density in some of these places actually ends up going down. So just to say, let's not conflate those two. I do think the efficient use of land has to be balanced with equity concerns and access to services. And so if you look at Dharavi and the overcrowded conditions people live in, even if they live in the heart of the city in close proximity to employment, they live in conditions where hundreds of households, for example, have access to one community toilet. And that is what needs to be kind of improved. Maybe you could think of situations where you have more mid-rise housing that is affordable and allows better sort of availability of services. One other point that somebody raised, how can we use this analysis by Solly to plan for the future? I think, again, speaking from the Ross Center perspective, where we help cities do a lot of this kind of planning, I see important applications to particularly address this challenge of the shortage of affordable housing. Why is San Francisco and New York the way it is? Why are so many cities around the world? Kinshasa is, again, one of the most expensive cities in Africa to live in. What can we do to increase the supply of affordable housing? And there, I think, really, if you start unpacking it the way Solly did, and if you can actually start identifying locations in the city where you have the data for those indicators, where overcrowding exists, can you start building more mid-rise affordable housing? Where you see lower residential shares, huge office parks, huge industrial parks, can you start to introduce housing there? So how can you use this analysis to increase the supply of land within the city in proximity to employment, well connected to services, for better supply of affordable housing for more people? And that's a way to manage the growth of urban populations that we're seeing in so many cities. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your responses, also for keeping so concise. Solly?
Thank you. I want to bring together what Alain said and what Anjali said, and talk about the future of the city and how we solve problems like affordability problems. And for me, the unifying paradigm is making room. What we have to do for these cities to function, both economically and in terms of housing, is to have enough room. So the people who are talking about the compact city, it's okay to have cities be compact, but within that footprint, you need to make room for building more floor space, for building more affordable housing. So the reason that Anjali, when she did the study of 300 cities, found affordability as an issue is the people that are talking about the compact city are not talking about making room. They're just saying, we don't want cities to expand. They're not saying, how can we accommodate the people within the confines of the present footprint? I also want to make a couple of short replies on Bogota. Bogota is a special case and an outlier in the sense that density has been increasing over time, while other cities in Latin America, densities have been in decline. So now it has one of the highest densities in Latin America. Part of the reason for that, and we've reported on it in a paper by Simon Gaviria and us called Invisible Cities, is Bogota. Colombia was in civil war. And in the civil war, people didn't want to live in the suburbs because traveling to the city could get them kidnapped for a ransom. So people preferred not to live in the suburbs, but to live in the city. And that is one of the main reasons that the city densified. And right now, with the end of the Civil War, it's slowly suburbanizing. One final comment to Tal Olster on the limits of the city and to Anonymous about measurement. About repeated measurement. We want to simplify the measurement of these parameters, and we've been working with WRI team to try to introduce artificial intelligence into measuring some of these parameters so that we can do it for all the cities in the world, but also for all small jurisdictions, not necessarily the city as a whole. So in terms of measurement, the challenge is to simplify and to make it possible to measure these both density and its parameters and factors in all cities all the time, so that we can keep on doing that and in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you. I think there are some questions, and I would ask on Fernando if you could take them and later on send it to the panelists and perhaps them to provide a response, because it would be unfair that they wrote something and they are neglected. So they will get some form of response to this. I was given 1 minute to conclude, and I think it's very difficult. And what I'm going to do is to select some keywords that I believe are important as a reflection of this. The first, and I think the video, Alan mentioned this several times, is an excellent way of decomposing density, which I fully agree, and connecting to policy options and the possibility of understanding how to address strategic densities in different kinds of cities. We need to pay attention to culture. We need to understand that indicators of density are rather neutral, but at the same time, in this relationship, it will be good to see how density connects to some fundamental elements. One, for instance, affordability, equity. The fundamental notion that economic growth, and I like what Alan mentioned, city GDP is not connected to density. And I think empirically we can prove that, but at the same time, there is a relationship of productivity and some forms of density, and perhaps here connectivity play an important role. Another interesting element is what Alan mentioned, density and infrastructure is not to change the place, is to change the infrastructure provision. Is to think in terms of better governance, better production of responses, and to create conditions for that. The last one from Soli, which we have discussed in the past, and I fully agree, the future of cities has a lot to do with accommodating for space from affordability and making room for economic growth and development in cities. I want to perhaps to stop here. I think it's always unfair because there are many things to say, but I want to remind you that the anatomy of density is a webinar, and today is only section 1. And you will be having 2 months with New York University and Marron Institute to continue this discussion with other partners, with other colleagues. So I want to express on behalf of the organizers, New York and Marron Institute, and of course from my part from UN Habitat, appreciate the invitation to be part of this. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. See you soon.